When you have a physical crisis, say you get bitten by a venomous snake out in the woods, your immediate priority is incredibly clear.
Right. You need antivenom, like right now.
Exactly. You need the antivenom. You certainly aren't looking for someone to, pull up a chair, sit beside you, and validate your feelings about the snake.
No, definitely not. You need a highly specific, objective biochemical cure to enter your bloodstream.
And you need it fast. I mean, you need something totally outside of yourself to enter your system and neutralize the poison. It's life or death, right?
Yeah.
And it is entirely objective.
Purely objective. The venom doesn't care how you feel about it.
Right. But when we transition from physical poison to, well, the human condition, like our spiritual, existential, or psychological brokenness, that clarity just suddenly vanishes.
It really does. It gets completely muddy.
It does. We stop looking for an objective here. Instead, we start looking for a coping mechanism. We look for someone to tell us that, the snake bite isn't our fault.
Yeah, and that the swelling in your leg is just a completely valid lived experience.
Yes, exactly. And that subtle shift from wanting a cure to wanting a coping mechanism is the exact collision we are unpacking today on this deep dive.
It's a huge topic.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
We are exploring a fascinating and honestly pretty disruptive philosophical critique. We are essentially asking, what happens when modern culture's absolute obsession with therapy and self-care rewires ancient beliefs about human existence?
And specifically, beliefs about the divine.
Right. Have we unintentionally transformed the historical flesh of Jesus from the cosmic savior of humanity into, well, a cosmic therapist?
It is a massive tectonic shift in how we view the world. And to explore it, we are pulling from a very dense but highly rewarding theological essay.
Tell us the title of this one.
It's called The Metaphysical Anchor, a Chalcedonian critique of modern therapeutic Christology.
That is a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But this source pulls from historical church documents, dogmatics, and modern cultural critiques to analyze a major paradigm shift in Western thought.
Which, I know, might sound intensely academic at first glance to you listening. You hear Chalcedonian critique, and you might think we are just dusting off old theological encyclopedias.
Right, like it's just ancient history.
Exactly. But this matters to you listening right now. Whether you are a theology buff, a student of cultural trends, or just someone trying to navigate the modern wellness landscape, understanding this shift is absolutely key.
Because it reveals everything about how modern society views human brokenness.
Yes. And consequently, where we look for the cure.
If you picture an ancient, weathered parchment gradually fading and merging into a modern psychoanalyst's couch, well, that's exactly where we are sitting today.
I love that image. So we need to start at the foundation. We can't really understand how far the modern world has drifted until we establish the baseline.
We have to go back in time.
Right. We are going back to the Council of Chalcedon in the year AD 451. And we need to paint a picture here, because these weren't just men sitting in a quiet, sterile room having a polite debate over tea.
Oh, far from it. I mean, the 5th century Roman Empire was a powder keg.
Totally.
You had massive political instability, and the theological debates at the time were literally spilling into the streets.
Wait, like actual riots?
Yes, actual riots. People in cities like Alexandria and Antioch were rioting over how to define the nature of Jesus. It was a matter of existential survival for the early church.
That is wild to think about today.
They were staring down controversies that threatened to completely tear Christian orthodoxy apart.
And I guess it makes sense why human nature would struggle with this, right? I mean, the idea of the incarnation, God becoming man, is inherently mind-bending.
It completely defies human logic.
So you had these different factions trying to make sense of it, and they essentially created this massive pendulum swing. Let's talk about the two extremes they were dealing with.
So on one side of the pendulum, you had Nestorianism.
Okay.
Which was essentially a form of dualism.
Yeah.
The followers of a bishop named Nestorius were so protective of God's divine purity that they couldn't stomach the idea of God's suffering.
Or growing tired or being bored.
Exactly. So they argued that Jesus was essentially two separate persons, a human person and a divine person, sort of just coexisting.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like a divine roommate living inside a human host.
That's a great way to put it.
The divine part does the miracles, and the human part takes the naps and feels the pain.
That's a helpful way to visualize it. But when that gets too messy and fragmented, human nature tends to overcorrect.
Right. The pendulum swings back
violently to the other extreme. And that was Eutychianism, or monophysitism.
Monophysitism.
A monk named Eutyches argued that Christ only had one nature. The human nature was entirely absorbed by the divine nature.
So if Nestorianism is two roommates who never really combine, Monophysitism is like dropping a single drop of vinegar into the ocean. The
Yes,
human part just dissolves into the divine part. It just becomes a smoothie.
a divine smoothie, yeah. And the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451 stepped into this chaos and planted a flag.
They had to stop the swinging pendulum.
They did. They asserted that both extremes actually destroy the possibility of salvation. So they formulated what became the absolute canonical boundary line for Orthodox Christology.
What was the actual ruling?
They declared that Jesus is one person and one underlying reality, but existing in two distinct natures, truly God and truly man.
But they didn't just leave it at that broad statement, did they? They locked this down using 4 very specific Latin adverbs to describe how these two natures interact.
They established the metaphysical anchor our source is talking about using 4 negative boundaries:
Okay, lay them on me.
inconfuse, immutabiliter, indivise, and inseparabiliter.
Okay, hold on. My Latin is a little rusty. But basically that translates to without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation.
Correct. The two natures exist together without being confused into a third thing.
No smoothie.
Right, no smoothie. And without changing their essential properties, without being divided into two separate persons, and without being separated from one another.
I was trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this, and it made me think of an impossible physics experiment.
You like this?
Imagine you have a roaring flame and a solid block of ice. Now imagine they are occupying the exact same space at the exact same time.
Okay.
But, and here's the impossible part, the fire doesn't melt the ice and the ice doesn't extinguish the fire.
Wow.
Yeah, they are perfectly united in one space, yet they retain their entirely distinct properties. The ice is still freezing, the fire is still burning, without confusion, without change.
That analogy captures the mechanics beautifully, but it also points to the why of Chalcedon.
Why they fought so hard for it.
Yes. The Council Fathers weren't just being pedantic. They weren't just obsessed with flexing their abstract Greek philosophy.
Right, it wasn't just an academic exercise.
No, they were fiercely protecting this framework because it was the required mechanism for classical salvation, for soteriology.
Soteriology being the doctrine of how humanity is actually saved.
Right. Think about your fire and ice. If the fire melts the ice, if the divine nature absorbs the human nature, like Eutyches claimed, then humanity hasn't actually been united to God.
Because the human part is gone.
Exactly. God just steamrolled and destroyed the human element. Conversely, if you separate them like Nestorius, you just have a fire over here and ice over there.
So the bridge between humanity and the divine completely collapses.
Completely. If Jesus isn't truly human, he can't represent us.
And if he isn't truly divine, his sacrifice has no infinite cosmic power to actually fix the broken universe.
Which is why those 4 adverbs, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, they act as the non-negotiable guardrails, keeping the bridge intact.
And this complex, deeply metaphysical framework held strong for centuries. I mean, it was the unquestioned baseline of Western Christian thought.
For a very long time, yes.
But our source text argues that in the late modern Western world, we have unclipped ourselves from this anchor entirely. We are drifting in a totally different ocean now.
A completely different paradigm.
So what caused the break? Because it wasn't like someone just woke up in 1995 and wrote a better theological treatise that debunked AD 451.
No, it wasn't a theological argument that broke the anchor. It was a cultural tidal wave.
A cultural tidal wave.
The source details a massive, slow-moving cultural mutation away from classical theology and straight into a framework of subjective emotional healing.
Right.
The text refers to this as the rise of the psychological man.
Psychological man, let's talk about that. To really understand this cultural mutation, I think we have to look at a concept the source brings up called expressive individualism.
Expressive individualism is the absolute key to diagnosing modern culture. In late modernity, the primary quest of a human being fundamentally shifted.
Let's ground this in reality for a second. Imagine a 17th century farmer.
Okay, tracting.
His ultimate goal in life was likely survival, moral duty to his community, and religious justification before a holy God. His sense of self was tied up in his objective duties.
Very external.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to a 2024 tech worker living in a major city. What is their ultimate metric for a successful life?
It's definitely not objective duty.
No, it's feeling authentic. It's psychological well-being. It's in expressing their inner unique self.
That is expressive individualism in a nutshell. It grants our individual, subjective feelings the status of moral imperatives.
It's crazy when you think about it.
Society is now conditioned to evaluate literally all truth claims by one single metric. Does this promote my immediate subjective comfort?
Does this validate my lived experience, right?
Yes. If something makes us feel bad, we don't just say it's uncomfortable, we say it's toxic or unsafe.
We evaluate truth based on vibes, and this forces theology to undergo a radical and honestly pretty terrifying translation.
It does.
The source shows how theologians like Jürgen Moltmann began distinguishing between traditional apologetic Christology, which defended these old dogmas and metaphysical formulas, and what he termed therapeutic Christology.
Therapeutic Christology argues that theology needs to directly confront human misery with a framework centered entirely on healing and wholeness.
It sounds good on the surface.
It does. But within this framework, the identity of Christ is derived almost entirely from his functional utility.
Wait, what does that mean in practice?
It means we only ask, how does he restore human dignity? How does he alleviate our emotional suffering? How does he liberate individuals from oppressive societal structures?
And the most profound part of the essay is how it maps out the redefinition of sin in this new culture. In the classical Chalcedonian framework, sin is an objective reality.
It's ontological alienation from God.
Right, it's a moral transgression that incurs objective guilt and requires an objective divine reconciliation, but under the lens of the psychological man.
Sin is reinterpreted as psychic trauma.
It becomes brokenness, low self-esteem, existential disorientation. It's no longer a crime against the creator, it's a failure to self-actualize.
And obviously, if you completely redefine the disease, you have to completely redefine the cure.
You have to.
Jesus goes from being the eternal Word made flesh, who assumes human nature, to literally redeem it from death and corruption into an empathetic companion.
He becomes a psychological archetype, a cosmic therapist whose primary job is to validate your internal self-identity. Wait, I have to jump in here and play devil's advocate for the listener because I feel the tension here.
Go for it.
Isn't emotional healing a fundamentally good thing? I mean, look around. Society is hurting, people are traumatized, anxious, and suffering from crushing low self-esteem.
That is undeniable.
Right, so if people are in pain, shouldn't theology adapt to meet them where they are? Why is the source so incredibly critical of wanting a Jesus who is empathetic to our mental health?
This raises an important question, and it is the exact question modern culture asks. It is crucial to understand the source's precise response here.
Okay, hit me.
The essay is not arguing against emotional healing. It is not saying empathy is bad or that psychology is evil. It is arguing against reductionism.
Reducing something wildly complex to just one of its tiny parts?
Precisely. When expressive individualism makes our subjective feeling the ultimate moral imperative, the metaphors of the hospital and the counseling room don't just sit alongside the judicial and metaphysical realities.
They take over.
They entirely replace them.
Yeah.
Jesus' identity is reduced merely to his functional utility in alleviating our emotional suffering. He becomes nothing more than a cosmic therapist.
It's the cultural reflex we talked about earlier. If someone tells you a hard truth that doesn't validate your current emotional state, our modern reflex is to reject the truth entirely.
We say, well, that's not my truth.
Right. The source argues this exact reflex has rewritten theology. We've collectively decided that if Jesus' primary job isn't making us feel subjectively whole and validated right this second, then that version of Jesus is irrelevant to us.
And that cultural reflex creates a massive, structurally fatal flaw in how we approach the divine. Theologians actually have a specific name for this trap.
What is it?
When we define Jesus entirely by what he does for our feelings, rather than who he actually is in his being, we commit what is called the functionalist fallacy.
The functionalist fallacy. This brings us to a major figure in the essay, the theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg.
Pannenberg issued a profound warning about this exact dynamic. He argued that when Christology, the study of who Christ actually is treated merely as a function of soteriology, or what Christ does for us, faith inevitably degenerates into projection and wish fulfillment.
Let me try to put Pannenberg's warning into a more everyday context. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's think about a marriage.
Okay.
Imagine you marry someone strictly for their functional utility. You marry them because they pay your bills, they make you laugh, they cook great meals, and they make you feel incredibly validated and secure.
Sounds like a pretty fragile setup.
Exactly. What happens when they lose their job? What happens when you get bored? Or they go through a severe clinical depression and can't make you laugh anymore?
The relationship collapses entirely.
It collapses because it was built entirely on function. It was
Yeah.
built on what they provided for your subjective
Not
experience.
on who they are.
Right. It wasn't built on the ontological reality of loving that person for exactly who they are in their very being, regardless of what they are functionally doing for you on any given Tuesday.
What's fascinating here is your marriage analogy perfectly illustrates Pannenberg's point about projection.
How so?
If we start with our modern psychological needs, I need to feel validated, I need to feel seen, I need relief from my anxiety, we will inevitably construct an idol of Jesus that perfectly matches those specific needs.
Wow. We fashion a deity in the image of our modern psychological requirements.
We project our modern therapy needs onto the sky and call the projection Jesus.
That is heavy.
Yes. And this is where the Chalcedonian definition from AD 451 proves its enduring genius, because it reverses this modern inversion completely.
It flips it back.
Chalcedon maintains the absolute primacy of ontology over function. Ontology meaning the study of being. Who he is must always precede what he does.
So, Christ's saving actions only work objectively because of who he is. The source text uses the term homoousios, meaning of the same substance,
Right.
because he is of the exact same substance with God and of the exact same substance with humanity. The bridge exists.
His therapeutic capacity, his ability to actually heal humanity, isn't just some abstract emotional function or a nice sentiment.
Right, it's grounded in reality.
In the classical view, it is the direct overflow of the hypostatic union. Because divine life has literally interpenetrated human existence in his person without dismantling it, real healing is possible.
And if you separate from that metaphysical anchor,
All these modern therapeutic promises just become well-intentioned psychological coping mechanisms. They have no cosmic saving power.
the text maps out two completely different causal trajectories here, and I want to highlight them because they represent the entire crux of the argument.
They really do.
So the classical Chalcedonian trajectory goes like this. First, metaphysical reality, the incarnation, God becoming man. Then, objective redemption, the historical acts of the cross and resurrection. And finally, as a downstream consequence of those objective realities, subjective transformation, our emotional and relational healing.
Objective reality, leading to objective action, culminating in subjective feeling. The reality dictates the feeling.
But the modern therapeutic trajectory reverses it entirely. It starts with subjective human need,
Right.
then it moves to a projected, constructed image of Jesus to meet that need. And it terminates in subjective coping strategies. It starts in the self and ends in the self.
And when we trap ourselves in that subjective loop, when we try to construct this culturally relevant, highly therapeutic Jesus, the source text points out an incredible irony.
What's the irony?
We think we're being so modern, progressive, and attuned to mental health, but we actually end up repeating 1,500-year-old mistakes. We wander right back into the ancient heresies that Chalcedon was specifically convened to reject.
It's the pendulum swinging wildly again. We think we're inventing a new empathetic theology, but we are just recreating 5th century errors in modern counseling rooms.
Exactly.
Let's look at how this happens, starting with the first one. Therapeutic monophysitism.
Remember, monophysitism was Eutyches' idea that the divine and human natures just blended together into one smoothie, with the divine absorbing the human.
Right, the vinegar in the ocean.
Modern therapeutic models often recreate this by collapsing the divine nature into human psychological states.
Wait, really? Let me make sure I understand this. Are you saying we literally equate our own inner feelings with God?
Essentially, yes. By treating human self-expression or the attainment of emotional relief as directly identical with the divine will, we absorb God's transcendence into our own subjective interiority.
So we make ourselves the ultimate authority.
We essentially say, my truest, most authentic inner feeling is the voice of God. My emotional boundary is the divine will. That is a confusion of natures. Chalcedon explicitly forbids this. It says the properties of each nature must be preserved. God is God, and you are you. Your feelings are not the Almighty.
Okay, that is a jarring realization. That's the first error, turning our own feelings into God. What about the other side of the pendulum? Therapeutic Nestorianism, the separation of the natures.
This happens when modern therapeutic Christology confines its gaze purely to the historical human Jesus.
Just the guy who walked around Galilee.
Right. It views him merely as an incredibly empathetic human partner, a compassionate counselor, a radical social worker, or perhaps a noble victim who achieved extraordinary psychological wholeness.
So he becomes a model for our own self-actualization, but nothing more.
Precisely.
So by trying to make Jesus hyper-relatable and down to earth, we actually lose him entirely. We either turn our own messy emotions into God, or we turn God into just a really effective life coach.
That is exactly the critique. When you turn him into just a noble human example of psychological wholeness, you sever the human Jesus from the eternal subject of the divine logos.
You break the bridge.
You reproduce Nestorian dualism.
Mm.
You divide the human instrument from the divine son. And if you do that, the cross becomes just a tragic, inspiring story of a noble human victim standing up to the Roman Empire.
It's just a good story, then.
It is completely devoid of any cosmic, metaphysical saving power.
Because if he's just a guy who is really good at processing trauma, his death doesn't objectively heal the ontological corruption of the universe. It doesn't defeat death. It's just an inspiring TED Talk on resilience.
Exactly. If you confuse the natures, therapeutic monophysitism, you lose the transcendence required to actually reach down from outside and save humanity.
God becomes nothing more than your inner voice.
And if you separate them, therapeutic Nestorianism, you lose the divine power of the historical act. God is just a distant observer of a very good human being.
Both approaches violate the 4 Chalcedonian adverbs. They either confuse, change, divide, or separate. But this leads me to a massive question, and I struggle with this. If the modern inside-out approach, this idea of looking entirely inward for divine validation, is structurally flawed, how is the classical divine-human interaction actually supposed to work?
It's a great question.
Like, if Jesus is totally God and totally human, how does the divine part not just completely overwrite the human part? If you drop a nuclear bomb into a thimble, the thimble is gone.
That is a brilliant question, and it's one the early church wrestled with deeply. The answer lies in a concept called non-competitive transcendence.
Non-competitive transcendence. Okay, explain that.
Yes. The therapeutic culture, as we've said, treats subjective interiority as the supreme arbiter of reality. But classical theology argues that God is not a finite creature competing for space within the created order.
So my analogy is wrong.
Your nuclear bomb in a thimble analogy assumes God and humanity are 2 physical objects competing for the same physical volume.
Okay, so it's not like pouring water into a glass that's already full of oil, where one substance physically has to displace the other to fit inside the glass.
All right, they don't compete for the same finite space.
It's more like, well, maybe light filling a room. The light doesn't compete with the furniture for space. It doesn't displace the couch or the bookshelf.
Yes,
It
exactly.
illuminates them. It enhances everything that's already there, revealing its true nature without crushing it.
That is a perfect way to understand non-competitive transcendence. Because God is infinite and transcendent, the divine logos can unite with human nature in the hypostatic union without compromising, violating, or absorbing human integrity.
The light fills the room without crushing the furniture.
Exactly.
So humanity is elevated not by God just sitting there validating our subjective desires in the dark, but by the ego surrendering to the objective reality of the word. The light enters the room and shows us what is actually there, rather than just validating whatever monsters or fantasies we imagined in the dark.
And the implications of this are staggering. It means true human flourishing doesn't require God to validate our every feeling.
Right, because our feelings aren't the ultimate reality.
In fact, demanding that he does so traps us in the dark. Furthermore, the source text brings in contemporary theologians like T.F. Torrance and Eric Maskell to remind us of something modern therapeutic models almost entirely ignore.
Which is?
The ascended Christ.
Right. The classical view doesn't just leave Jesus in the 1st century as a historical footnote, and it doesn't just turn him into a vague, warm, spiritual feeling in our chest today.
Torrance and Maskell emphasize that Chalcedon applies directly to the ascended Lord right now. Jesus remains fully divine and fully human in a glorified body today.
So he's still active.
He is a perpetual mediator, a high priest who stands outside of us. Modern therapeutic Christology restricts its scope to our subjective psychological states, which obscures this objective heavenly intercession.
It just turns us inward again.
It traps the believer within the fragile confines of their own internal emotional experience.
And let's be fiercely honest for a second. Being trapped in your own internal emotional experience is exhausting.
It's terrible.
If my connection to the divine or my ultimate healing is solely dependent on how at peace I feel today, or how perfectly I've processed my childhood trauma, I am on a never-ending treadmill. It's a terrifying amount of pressure.
It is an incredible burden to place on the human psyche. We were never meant to be our own saviors, not even in the psychological sense.
Now, I can hear a critic listening to all of this and pushing back. They might think, okay, this traditional dogma sounds very precise, it protects the transcendence of God, sure, but it also sounds incredibly cold.
I can see why someone would think that.
It sounds academic, Greek, and frankly, completely indifferent to actual human suffering on the ground. When I'm having a panic attack, Chalcedonian adverbs don't comfort me.
Right.
But the source text anticipates this exact critique, doesn't it?
It does, and it pushes back on that assumption hard. The text reveals that the early church actually had a massive, robust therapeutic framework of its own. It wasn't cold or indifferent to suffering at all.
The early church fathers, figures like Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius, the Cappadocian fathers, they were deeply concerned with therapy, just not our modern definition of it.
Exactly. They didn't shy away from the concept of healing. In fact, they frequently used the motif of Christus Medicus, which translates to Christ the divine physician.
Christ the divine physician.
The essential difference between their era and ours lies entirely in how each paradigm defines the disease, and consequently the cure.
Let's break that down. Under the patristic model, the Christus Medicus model, what is the actual disease?
The fundamental human ailment is not emotional discomfort. It's not psychological maladjustment, anxiety, or low self-esteem.
Those are symptoms.
The root disease is ontological corruption, in Latin, corruptio.
Ontological corruption, a disease of our very being.
It is death, spiritual decay, and bondage to sin. It is a fundamental breaking of human nature at the structural level. We are separated from the source of life, and therefore we are decaying.
So the disease isn't just that I feel bad today, it's that my nature is subjected to death and decay. And therefore, the cure has to be infinitely more radical than just a really good therapy session.
The cure is the incarnation itself. The divine physician does not address this condition through psychological sympathy. He doesn't just offer moral instruction from a distance.
So what does he do?
The Logos assumes human nature in its totality, taking on a real human body and a rational human soul in order to heal it from the inside out.
There is a quote in the source text from Gregory of Nazianzus that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. It is an ancient axiom that sums this up perfectly. What is not assumed is not healed.
What is not assumed is not healed. It's brilliant.
That is such a profound sentence. It means the divine physician doesn't just sit across the room in a leather chair, listen to our problems, write a prescription, and slide it across the desk to us.
No, he gets involved.
He actually takes on the sickness himself. He assumes the entirety of our broken, diseased human nature into his own person to eradicate the disease from within.
And the theological mechanism for this is what they call the communicatio idiomatum, or the exchange of properties.
The exchange of property.
Through the hypostatic union, that fire and ice coming together, the divine properties of incorruptibility and eternal life permeate Christ's assumed humanity. He destroys death from the inside. He purifies human nature by uniting it to divine life.
So to put these two models side by side, modern therapy offers immediate psychological relief. It gives us vital coping mechanisms for our trauma.
Yes.
But the patristic model offers total cosmic and bodily recreation. The Greek term is theosis, or deification.
One is a temporary bandage for a fallen world, which, to be entirely clear, is a good and necessary bandage when you are bleeding.
Sure, absolutely.
But the other is a permanent ontological cure. Patristic healing is an objective reality. It is mediated through tangible things like sacraments, baptism, and the Eucharist to permanently restore the imago Dei, the image of God in humanity.
I want you, the listener, to really consider the immense relief in this classical framework. Think about it. If the cure for your deepest existential brokenness relies entirely on your own ability to self-reflect, to go to enough therapy sessions, to read enough self-help books, and to endlessly maintain your own inner emotional peace, well, you will eventually collapse under the weight of it.
It's inevitable.
But if the cure is an objective reality, an accomplished fact handled entirely outside of yourself by the divine physician who took on your nature to defeat death, that takes a tremendous crushing burden off your shoulders. Your ultimate healing isn't dependent on your emotional performance today.
It is a profoundly liberating dogmatic truth. It frees you from the tyranny of your own shifting emotions.
Right.
But it brings us to the inevitable final question.
The practical application.
Right, the so what?
What does this all mean for the modern churchgoer, or for anyone seeking soul care today? Are churches supposed to just ban psychology? Should they stop offering counseling, fire their therapists, and stop trying to be welcoming, empathetic places?
No, and the text is very careful to establish proper boundaries here. The essay does not demand the rejection of psychology, emotional care, or clinical counseling ministries.
That would be absurd.
What it does is establish a strict hierarchy. It insists that pastoral care must be subservient to objective Christological dogma.
Dogma has to be the anchor, and psychology is just one of the tools on the ship.
Exactly. When practical theology or a church's weekly worship adopts the therapeutic culture as its actual foundation, it strips the faith of its true transformative power.
It loses its teeth.
It replaces dogmatic realism, the objective facts of the gospel, with emotional management.
And the source argues this leads directly to a phenomenon called ecclesial consumerism. And I think anyone who has observed modern religion will instantly recognize this.
Ecclesial consumerism is the natural endpoint of expressive individualism in the religious sphere. It's believers selecting religious communities strictly based on personal therapeutic utility.
They ask, which church makes me feel the best about myself? Which worship band gives me the best emotional high? Which pastor's sermon perfectly validates my current political or emotional state without challenging me?
Exactly.
It's shopping for a church the exact same way you'd shop for a day spa or a life coach.
And if a community's only goal is to attract people by making their egos feel validated, they are actively participating in that consumerism. They're starving their people of the actual cure.
So what is true soul care then?
True soul care, according to the Chalcedonian framework, requires something much harder but infinitely more real. It requires pointing the suffering human being away from their isolated inward-looking self and directing them outward toward the ascended divine human Lord.
It offers an eternal communion that transcends our temporary emotional coping. It offers the antivenom, not just a sympathetic nod about the snake bite.
And that is the true metaphysical anchor.
So let's take a breath and recap this incredible journey we've been on. We started in the messy, politically charged streets of the 5th century, landing at the rigid, fiercely protected boundaries of AD 451 at the Council of Chalcedon.
Right, the four adverbs.
We unpacked the metaphysical anchor of one person, two natures, united without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation.
We then explored the modern cultural shift toward the psychological man. We saw how expressive individualism demands that we evaluate all truth by our subjective feelings, turning Jesus into nothing more than a cosmic therapist.
We looked at Pannenberg's warning about the functionalist fallacy, where we project our own emotional needs onto God, like a bad marriage built only on utility.
Built on function, yeah.
We saw how this accidental recreation of ancient heresies like monophysitism and Nestorianism strips the cross of its cosmic saving power.
And finally, we recovered the profound ancient vision of the divine physician, the Christus Medicus, who doesn't just sit back and validate our emotional distress, but assumes our very nature to cure our ontological corruption and defeat death itself from the inside out.
While modern psychology has given us incredible, vital tools for navigating distress in this life, the source forcefully argues that elevating those subjective feelings to the status of ultimate truth deprives us.
It really does.
It robs us of the profound, objective, and cosmic healing offered by classical dogma.
It's a reminder that true peace comes from looking outside of ourselves.
It really is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've talked about today, but pushes it into the very near future.
How interesting.
We live in an era where technology and culture are completely obsessed with mirroring our feelings back to us. We have algorithms designed to curate our feeds so we only see what we want to see.
Right, echo chambers.
Very, very soon, AI could easily serve as a perfectly empathetic, personalized therapy bot. A digital companion that is programmed to perfectly validate your every subjective emotion, never challenge your assumptions, and constantly affirm your inner psychological state.
It's a slightly terrifying thought.
It is. If that happens, if we can instantly manufacture perfect subjective validation on our phones, you have to ask yourself a hard question. Does true human flourishing actually require us to encounter something completely unprogrammable?
Something that pushes back.
Yes,
Yeah.
something completely outside of our own self that doesn't just validate us in the dark, but fundamentally ontologically transforms us in the light.
A question that Chalcedon answered 1,500 years ago, and one we still really need today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a challenging, brilliant conversation. Keep questioning the anchor, and we will catch you next time.